Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Chapter 3. Blood Country. Autumn rays of sun twinkled off tall, pointed spires, visible through the high bay windows of the finest blown glass which encircled the throne room. Uphaven was unlike other boroughs. The capital city grew upward, an attempt to match the splendor of the great tree which overlooked the vast countryside. Vladimir Hemming sat languidly on a throne made of living wood, carved from the very heart of the massive tree, and was elevated on a dais of tiered platforms. The throne room felt wholly unique, as if one was sitting in the open air upon one of the tree's innumerable thick branches and looking out. Subsequently, there was not a more beautiful place in all of Landor to watch the sun set. "My lord?" a wan voice questioned. "What?" Vladimir said, perturbed. He tore his gaze away from the splendor of the city, back to the proceedings happening below. He shifted his weight forward and frowned slightly. Petitions had to be the most dull part of being king. A dark brown rabbit in simple garb, with a large brimmed hat, stood looking resolutely up at the throne. Thick arms protruded from rolled-up sleeves, and were crossed determinately in front of a heavy chest. Next to the brawny rabbit was Vladimir's steward, Pip. As if by deliberate contrast, Pip was a thin gray rabbit, neatly combed and wearing a fine vest of black silk. His round golden spectacles flashed as he rifled through a dossier. "Master, The steward paused briefly to check a page of his dossier. "Perch, my lord," the brown rabbit supplemented. "Ah, yes. Thank you," Pip said quickly. "Master Perch here has petitioned the use of an outcaster." "Aye, 's right," Perch said. "If'n we don't get the mold under control, there won't be squat for mashing come harvest time. It's already taken most all west the ford and spreading like a fire in hay." The rabbit had a very quick, thick accent. He didn't seem to breathe between his words, and they all strung together in quick fashion as one unbroken diatribe. King Vladimir looked quizzically at his steward and hoped a translation was forthcoming. The king had understood little of what Perch had actually said. He did not travel the kingdom as much nowadays, and the hedgefolk seemed to have abandoned the proper speech. The brown rabbit opened his mouth to speak again, but the steward Pip cut in quickly. "I would remind Master Perch that royal outcasters are a highly limited resource," Pip said as he removed a small silver pocket watch from his vest as a bell chimed somewhere in the city. He checked the time and began to wind the gear knob slowly, setting the hands accordingly. "I was under the impression that there were more traditional methods of removing pests, alchemy and whatnot." Pip pocketed the watch. "Am I mistaken?" he added with finality. Vladimir watched his steward work, his trade in wonderment. The prim little rabbit was by far the best gold the kingdom had ever spent. Perch prickled slightly, annoyance clearly visible on his rough face. "'Twas a time," he paused, uncharacteristically for him, and put weight on the next word. "Before, that is, that and such methods worked. And begging your pardon, but's taxation on alchemists so high, I can't turn a profit." The brown rabbit stood firmly resolute, but he glanced anxiously at the king. "I've never missed a quota to the crown yet," his words quickened, "and I don't have a mind to now, but we need help, my lord." It was an earnest plea. A noise sounded from the back of the audience chamber, which drew everyone's attention. The great doors had opened and a tall, very slender, buckskin rabbit was admitted. His boots echoed off the polished wooden floor as he made his way quickly towards the throne. He wore a shirt of light scale mail, whose tiny overlapping protective plates were crafted in the design of feathers. His sky blue tabard had black embroidery on the edges which placed the soldier from the Falcon Corps. Two beautifully crafted silver wings ornamented the Sky Rider's helm and reached skyward in order to protect his long ears. The sun flashed brilliantly off his armor as he passed the great windows, and a silver light suddenly danced throughout the hall. The newcomer came to an abrupt halt next to Pip and the heavily awestruck Master Perch, who looked at the Sky Rider as if he had never seen a sight so captivating. The soldier drew a paw up to his chest in salute. His gauntlet chinked as it met the feathered scales of his cuirass. "Apologies, my lord," said the buckskin soldier in a clipped tone as he addressed the throne. "There's been news from the eastern reaches." The rabbit opened a small pouch at his waist and produced a tightly rolled scroll of parchment, which he gave over to the steward. Pip carefully checked the seal laid upon the wax, broke it, and unrolled the missive. Vladimir moved to the edge of his seat. All drowsiness seemed to have left the king as Pip's eyes darted quickly across the parchment. The thick rabbit next to Pip looked incredulous that his petition had apparently been forgotten with such flippant ease. He opened his mouth and said, what about my?" before he was cut off. "Thank you, Master Perch, for bringing your concerns to the attention of the king today," Pip said in a tight voice, his eyes never leaving the parchment. "An outcaster will not be forthcoming. Your lack of proper preparation to see to your charge, and thereby invoking loss, does not garner additional support from the crown. Your audience today has ended. Go now, and may you ever find shelter under the eaves of the great tree." Perch stood shocked, mouth slightly agape at the abrupt dismissal. The heavy brown rabbit looked around at each of them, first at the king, then bitterly at the steward, and finally at the soldier which had so effectively upstaged him. With a sour look, Perch snapped his mouth closed, turned on his heel, and proceeded back down the audience chamber with many a grumble under his breath. It was customary for subjects to extend a formal farewell at the end of an audience. The failure to do so was a great dishonor. Open contempt of a ruling, as displayed by the thick rabbit, usually held a penalty of flogging at the very least. However, Vladimir's attention was solely focused on Pip and the parchment he held. The king rubbed rhythmically at his chest. The stifling fabric of his doublet seemed to be causing him no small amount of anguish. Meanwhile, the prim little rabbit Pip was taking his time reading the parchment thoroughly. The tension in the audience chamber grew to an unbearable state. "Speak, Pip," Vladimir commanded when nerves finally got the better of the king. "It appears to be from Lieutenant Baxus." Pip paused while the sound of the great wooden doors of the hall opened, then closed again with an accompanying bang. "Yes?" Vladimir prodded in a strained voice. "The caravan sent to Medagaz seems to have been accosted." Pip sighed and let the sheaf of parchment spring back into a tight roll. "By whom?" Vladimir demanded. The king quickly stood up from the throne and proceeded down the wide steps. When he reached the bottom of the platform, he took the scroll from Pip and unrolled it for himself. "He claims it was Brightfur, my lord." Pip sounded very weary. "Brightfur!" Vladimir exclaimed in fury. He hurled the unread parchment away as if it had just caught fire, and it spun dejectedly to the floor. "That caravan was carrying 60 cases of our best, along with no small amount of gold. Medagaz is already in a tirade over shipping lanes, and now this?" The king pulled at the collar of his doublet and walked swiftly over to a small table that held a decanter of wine. Normally the wine was for petitioners, a tradition as old as Landor itself. The king shared his best with those who sought his judgment. Vladimir took a goblet, poured a measure of dark crimson wine into it, then drained it in one swallow. The wine seemed to ease the king's nerves a bit, and he turned with renewed vigor towards the Sky Rider. "Now you listen here," Vladimir said as he advanced towards the tall, lanky soldier. He grabbed the sky-blue fabric of the rider's tabard and shook it slightly. "You tell Baxus I don't care what he has to do, but he is to find that caravan and deliver it to Medagaz. Take an entire squadron of riders if that's what it takes to find it. Vladimir practically threw the soldier from him. Get going, now. Right away, my lord, the Skyrider said. He made a quick salute and added, until the leaves falter. Vladimir half-heartedly touched his paw to his heart before waving away the Skyrider in a clear dismissal. The gesture was a proper dismissal by royalty, if flippantly performed. The soldier turned and trotted to the large doors of the audience chamber, the scales of his mail performing a tinkling cacophony that reverberated through the hall as he went. What is left, Pip? Vladimir asked as he returned to the small table which held the wine and stared into its crimson depths. Pip looked down at the documents remaining. An altercation between two nobles involving a tavern and a tuk-tuk, it would seem. Pip shuffled the papers, then pulled a last document from the case. The parchment retained a large official seal in black wax. And then there is this. Pip's voice became darker as he brandished the parchment. From the outer heed. Vladimir went slightly rigid at those words. Send them away. I am done for today, the king said in a weary tone as he picked up another goblet of wine. It was late evening. The sun had long gone down over the horizon, and the throne room of the great tree now stood quiet. Its large windows cast a warm glow over the city from torches within, which stayed lit throughout the night. Some way off, by way of long, intertwined and intricate passages, was connected the royal quarters, and then by the same hallways and after many twists and turns, branches and merges, were the royal barracks. These places of import were carved from the insides of the great tree and connected by a myriad of lavish passages. But in addition to the complex warren that was the tree itself, even more structures extended outward into various buildings, courtyards, stables, and gardens, eventually all ending at a stout wall of thick reddish-brown brick which encircled the entirety of the great tree. All of this culminated into what the citizens of the capital knew as Arbor Keep. King Vladimir strolled leisurely through the darkened passages of the great tree, enjoying one of his favorite evening rituals, walking off a large supper while he sipped a glass of strong, fine wine. The darkness had a soothing effect, and the wine had finally driven away the incessant headache which had plagued the king for hours. In the distance, Vladimir heard jovial voices come up a path that branched away from his own. He stopped and listened for a moment, then made for them out of curiosity. He approached quietly, and when he found the speakers, he leaned against a darkened pillar, content to observe. In a recessed alcove, 4 rabbits gathered around a small cooking pot, the king's guard and their captain. They were in good humors by the sound of it, and seemed to have just finished their own supper. "Evening, Gerald?" Vladimir said as the sharp-eyed captain spied him. Gerald sprung to his feet and made a movement to marshal his guard to attention. However, Vladimir stopped him with a casually raised paw. "Don't make a fuss, Captain. Tell me." Vladimir motioned towards the other guards. "What is the occasion?" The guards were pulling drinks from a large cask and passing goblets of amber-colored wine to each member of the unit. They looked up at the sound of voices and paused when they finally noticed the king amongst them. "Young Macy here has finally joined the ranks of the Royal Guard," Gerald said, pointing towards a silver rabbit at the back of the alcove. The rabbit indicated was a petite doe. The new livery looked slightly large on her tiny frame, but she beamed brightly at the words, Royal Guard. "A christening! What fortuitous timing," Vladimir said. The king raised his goblet, held it out in front of him, and waited. "Captain, I believe the honor falls to you." The captain turned quickly and accepted a goblet proffered him by one of the guard. He raised the goblet to chest height and looked directly at Maisie. "Bourbon, until the leaves falter," Gerald said, and then drank. The rest of the unit drank after him, all draining their goblets in a long, unbroken draught. There was a collective intake of breath, and the nearest guard slapped young Maisie on the back. She choked on her half-finished glass, and there was a hearty laugh as Maisie spluttered and coughed, uncontrollably spitting wine upon the floor. All right, Gerald scolded. "Enough of that. Everyone back to your post. We've got a job to do after all." He turned to the king. "Shall I walk back with you, my lord?" he questioned as the rest of the guard gathered up helmets and weapons. By some odd occurrence, Maisie's gear kept avoiding her reach, which the rest of the guard was quick to point out. "No need," Vladimir answered with a wave of his paw. "I'm sure you've more pressing matters to attend to." There was a crash as Maisie, fed up with the shenanigans of the others, had thumped one about the ears with the flat of her long spear. "Farewell, Captain." Vladimir turned and walked back down the darkened hallway as the admonitions of the captain rang out behind him. The king made his way back to the dining hall. A great table of polished wood stood as the centerpiece of the large round hall, and at either end was set a fireplace. 2 chimneys spiraled down from the walls of the room and put out over the mouth of the pits to keep the smoke contained. Where and how they funneled the fumes out of the tree without catching it on fire, the king did not know, but he warmed his paws briefly in the flames, then moved to the table. He placed his empty crystal goblet on the edge of the table, which was now devoid of food. The king frowned. Sometimes the waitstaff were too practiced. His mind cast back to a particularly enjoyable jelly tart he was hoping to sample again. A door opened at the far end of the hall, and Nona, the queen, his wife, bustled in with a look of utter exasperation. She was a sandy-colored rabbit, garbed in a fine blue evening dress. White myrtle petals were embroidered along the hem of its long sleeves and around the bodice. The long cut of the dress trailed behind her as she walked. When Nona spotted Vladimir, she hurried towards him with a look that plainly said he had done something wrong. "Have you seen Kara?" Nona asked in an accusatory voice. "She was supposed to wait in the bedroom after her bath. I need to do her ears." Nona looked around the dark corners of the hall as if she expected to find the burrowing hiding behind one of the many fine vestiges of the room. "No, I've just finished my walk," Vladimir replied. "I was down at the barracks. Gerald has a new guard." Nona made a sound in the back of her throat, clearly annoyed. It did not escape Vladimir's notice, and he quickly said, "How about you check the west hall, and I'll do the east? She can't have gone far." "Very well." Nona turned on her heel and strode away, muttering something about tanning a hide. Vladimir raised his eyebrows, glad that her ire wasn't pointed at him. He grabbed a candelabrum off the large table and headed towards the doors to the east. He pushed the doors to East Hall open and held the light aloft. Shadows danced down the corridor away from him. Halfway down East Hall, he heard the small voice of his daughter, Kara, coming from the last room. Vladimir smiled to himself. Kara was the more imaginative of his 2 children, and she constantly talked to her made-up friends. A blessing in disguise when it came to finding the little doe, as those same imaginary friends always encouraged the adventurous little scamp to explore the most unlikely places in the keep. "Kara, honey, your mother is in an uproar." Vladimir's voice froze in his throat as he rounded the corner and the light fell upon his daughter sitting on the floor. She chatted happily, not to an imaginary friend, but instead to a dark sable wolf. "Your Majesty?" Wrath Longfang said slowly. He sat behind Kara, stroking the burrowling's delicate head with strong, hard paws forged by killing. "You've been avoiding me." He combed through the fur of the little doe's head with long, sharp claws. Vladimir trembled violently and nearly dropped the candelabrum. It took the king a while before he mastered himself enough to turn his head down the corridor and shout, "Gods!" "Oh, are we going to have a party?" Kara asked gleefully, bouncing slightly on the spot. Wrath didn't move, but continued to stroke, his amber eyes fixated on Vladimir. Hurried footsteps sounded down the corridor, and Nona burst into the room in a panic. When she saw the huge wolf sitting behind Kara, she drew up short, her paws flying to her mouth in a silenced scream. "So sweet at this age," Wrath said slowly. "You could just eat them up." His paw twitched sharply. "Hey!" Kara squeaked, grabbing the back of her head. She looked around accusatorially at Wrath. "Apologies, little one," Wrath said, removing his great paw from the burrowing. "Run along to your mother. Your father and I need to speak." Kara did as she was told, stood up, and ran to her mother's skirts. Nona was shaking from ear to toe as she enfolded the little doe in her arms. She hastily scooped her daughter up, stole a frightened look at Vladimir, then slowly backed out of the room. Vladimir reached out and closed the door behind her with a nervous paw. Wrath was still sitting, one paw idly raised as he examined a single drop of blood that clung to the tip of his claw. It flickered jewel-bright in the candlelight. "Moonshade, what a curious effect when added to wine," Wrath mused. His claw casually drifted to his muzzle, and he cleaned the blood from it with his tongue. The large wolf stood in one fluid motion. The sight of the looming wolf, half concealed in shadow, made Vladimir's stomach lurch horribly, and he couldn't suppress another shudder that passed through him. His breathing had devolved into quick, shallow spurts, and it was a struggle for him to say, "What do you want, Wrath?" "I want what is owed," Wrath said venomously, turning his hard gaze upon Vladimir. "We gave you the outer heed," Vladimir spluttered. "I held up my part of the bargain." "You traded me rocks for more rocks." Wrath's voice was composed, but his eyes flashed dangerously. "My clan are tired of rocks." "Well, what exactly do you—" "We want blood country," Wrath cut in. "Vineyards," Vladimir blustered. "That's right," Wrath growled. But I... Vladimir floundered. "Your pet can draw up what's fit," Wrath said. "Wolves don't do well in small places. We tend to get aggressive." The king was completely nonplussed. "But we can't just," he argued. "You know the price," Wrath said, taking a step back deeper into the shadow. "I'll be seeing you." 2 silver moons blazed briefly in the candlelight, then winked out. Morning's first light was long in coming. When it did crest the horizon, it illuminated the kingdom of Landor in a pink blaze, and the veiled tops of hills stood like small islands in a vast sea of fog. King Vladimir stood stiffly with his paws placed on a balustrade, overlooking the crowd gathered in a large circular courtyard. The round square, aptly named by some planner who fancied he had more wit than sense. Many uses this courtyard had. Most pertained to the finer arts, the display of crafted masterpieces, performances of spectacle of frivolity. Sometimes banquets were held under the watchful gaze of the stars. But today it held the art of judgment. A set of sturdy gallows stood darkly in the cold morning. "Vlad, please, don't do this," Nona pleaded. She placed a trembling paw on the king's sleeve. "I've known Gerald my whole life. I grew up with him. He was in my father's council. He's an honorable buck." Her eyes were puffy and red. She was still in her clothes from the night before and looked as if she hadn't slept. Pins and needles ran through Vladimir as he gripped the balustrade hard. Wrath had our little doe under his knife. He shot a terrified look at his wife. Gerald allowed that to happen. He looked away, back at the gathered crowd. A breeze with a threat of winter carried across the courtyard. Crows were perched on the roofs of the surrounding buildings, heckling all present with their harsh voices. Most of the gathered crowd were comprised of noble rabbits wrapped in thick cloaks. However, Vladimir spied a Reynard with a vixen tucked close to him for warmth, and a few wolves of refined birth huddled close around their alpha. Every head turned as a heavy door opened at the back of the courtyard. A flurry of hissing whispers issued as an enormous guard led the accused forward. Please, Nona whispered desperately, tightening her grip on Vladimir's sleeve. The guard positioned Gerald and 3 other rabbits on the gallows, including a very petite one with a silvery coat. Vladimir said nothing to his wife's pleas, but continued to look down at the proceedings with a cold, hard face. Nona's paw trembled, and slowly she released the king's sleeve as tears began to slide down her face, making the fur on her cheeks clump. Vladimir felt her move away from him, but did nothing to comfort her. The condemned were in place now. The guard looked towards the king's balcony, and 100 pair of eyes followed after. Vladimir felt a weight in his chest so great he thought he might splinter under the force of their stares. The king forced himself to release the balustrade. He had been gripping it so tightly he could no longer feel his fingers. He took a faltering step back, then turned away from the court. The guard's head sank slowly. The last petition of the accused had been denied. He moved to the base of the platform and threw a lever. 3 bodies hit hard, their ropes going taut. However, one was too light. The silver, she danced horribly. A rabbit caught in a strangling snare. The large guard ran to her quickly, enveloped her in a great hug, and added his weight to hers. The guard felt it happen. They were his charge, and it was the only mercy he could give her. A dark stillness settled over the square. The rashness of this judgment was hard to overcome. The guard knew it, as well as the assembled. Unbidden, a tear fell as the guard released the small doe and backed away from loyal comrades. His was not the only one, nor the last. The crows high above cared not. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.